The engine of the excavator screamed as the bucket slammed into something that should not have been there. 1 second, Parker Schnabel's crew was moving pay dirt like they had done 10,000 times before, and the next second the entire cut on the Klondike went silent. Metal had struck something that refused to give way, something buried so deep and so hard that for a moment nobody on the crew said a word. If what sits beneath that ridge really is what the early readings suggest, the number being whispered around the wash plant is 452 million. Stay with us, because what happens in the next few days on this claim could either be dismissed as nothing, or it could become the story that follows Parker Schnabel for the rest of his career. It started as an ordinary shift out on the Klondike. Parker had pushed his crew hard all season, chasing paying ground that had already proven itself, keeping the excavators moving and the wash plant fed from sunrise until the light gave out. The dozers had already stripped the overburden away days earlier, clearing a path down toward what the crew believed was just another stretch of familiar gravel. Nothing about the morning suggested anything unusual. The haul trucks rolled back and forth, the plant ran at full capacity, and Parker was doing what he always does, walking the cuts, checking the cleanups, and pushing his operators to keep the pace up before the season's clock ran out. Then, one of the excavator operators felt the bucket stop dead. Not the soft give of packed gravel, not the crunch of a boulder rolling out of the way, but a hard, flat resistance that sent a shudder through the whole machine. He tried again from a different angle, thinking maybe he had clipped the edge of a buried rock. The bucket hit the same wall. He backed off, repositioned, and tried a third time from the opposite side. Same result. Whatever was down, there was not a single stone. It had width. It had shape. And it was not moving. Word travels fast on a claim this size, and within minutes Parker himself was standing at the edge of the cut looking down into the hole. He has seen strange things come out of the ground before, old mining equipment left behind by crews decades gone, frozen mammoth bone, slabs of bedrock that fooled even experienced operators into thinking they had found something artificial. But something in the way this layer sat troubled him enough that he told the operator to back off and called in the rest of the crew to take a look before anyone touched it again. What they uncovered when they carefully peeled back the surrounding material was a compact, almost cemented layer of gravel sitting directly on top of what looked like an unusually smooth stretch of bedrock. In places, the material had a grayish, almost blackish tint that immediately caught Parker's eye. Anyone who has spent real time in placer mining knows that concentrations of black sand are not proof of gold by themselves, but they are exactly the kind of signal that makes a miner slow down and pay attention. Heavy minerals settle where water once slowed its pace, and water only slows down for a handful of reasons. One of the most promising being an old channel that has since been buried under thousands of years of shifting ground. Parker ordered the crew to stop pushing forward in that section and instead work carefully around the edges of the strange layer, exposing it inch by inch instead of ripping straight through it. That decision alone tells you how seriously he was taking it. Every hour spent being careful is an hour not spent processing ground, and on a short mining season in the Yukon, that time is not free. But Parker has built his entire operation on knowing when speed matters and when patience pays off, and this was clearly a moment where he chose patience. The next step was simple in theory and painstaking in practice. Small shovels full of the unusual gravel were pulled aside and taken straight to water for panning. This is the oldest test in mining, older than any wash plant or metal detector, and it remains the fastest way to get a first honest look at what a piece of ground is actually holding. As the lighter material spun away and the heavier concentrate settled toward the bottom of the pan, flecks of color began to show. Not a spectacular jackpot pan by any means, but enough consistent color that it was clearly not a fluke. One good pan does not make a season, and nobody on that crew needed reminding of that. Placer gold has a frustrating habit of hiding in pockets, showing up rich in one pan and completely vanishing 20 feet away. So instead of celebrating, the crew did what any disciplined operation does. They took additional samples from several points around the strange layer, spacing them out so they could start to understand whether this was a small, isolated pocket or something that extended further than anyone initially guessed. While the panning continued, Parker turned his attention to the layer itself. The unusual hardness that had stopped the excavator in the first place was not, it turned out, solid rock. It was a tightly packed mix of gravel and clay that had compacted over a very long time into something dense enough to resist the bucket. Beneath that compacted layer sat bedrock with a surface that was noticeably smoother and more rounded than the jagged bedrock typically found nearby. Rounded bedrock, smoothed over time, is one of the classic signs of an old watercourse. Rivers do not just carry sediment, they carry it against stone for centuries, wearing sharp edges down into curves. This is where the idea of an ancient buried channel started to take real shape in the crew's conversation. Thousands of years ago, long before any modern mining claim existed on this ground, a river may have run through exactly this spot, carrying sediment and, more importantly, carrying gold down from higher elevations. Gold is dramatically heavier than the sand and gravel around it, so as that ancient river slowed or changed direction, the gold would have dropped out first, settling into low points, cracks in the bedrock, and the kind of compacted gravel the crew had just exposed. Over the following centuries, the river shifted its course, and the old channel was buried under new layers of soil, leaving the gold sealed beneath the surface, waiting. That is the theory, and it is an exciting one, but Parker knows better than almost anyone in the industry that a theory is not the same thing as proven ground. To move from theory to something closer to certainty, the crew needed a much larger picture than a handful of handpans could provide. That meant bringing in test holes, spaced out in a rough grid around the original discovery point, each one drilled down to check the depth of the gravel, the shape of the bedrock beneath it, and whether the same telltale compacted layer showed up again and again. The early results were encouraging without being conclusive. Several of the test holes did hit a similar gravel and clay combination at comparable depths, and more than one showed the same smooth bedrock surface underneath. That kind of repetition matters enormously in placer mining. A single rich spot can be an accident of geology, a random pocket where gold happened to collect. A pattern that repeats across multiple holes starts to look like something bigger, something closer to an actual buried channel rather than a lucky anomaly. With that pattern building, Parker made the call to run a proper test cleanup. A small, carefully tracked batch of the unusual material was loaded separately from the rest of the day's pay dirt and sent through the wash plant on its own, so the crew could see exactly what came out of that specific layer without it being diluted or exaggerated by everything else being processed that day. This is the moment that actually matters in placer mining, far more than any single pan. A wash plant moves enormous volumes of material compared to a hand pan, and its cleanup gives a much more honest read on what an area is really producing per yard of dirt. When the mats were pulled and the concentrates were run down, the gold that came out was more than the crew expected going in. It was not a jaw-dropping, season-defining haul on its own, but it was enough gold from a relatively small, targeted batch to confirm that the earlier signs had not been a fluke. For a moment, the entire crew allowed themselves a bit of excitement. But Parker, ever the realist, was already talking about what needed to happen next rather than what had already happened. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about placer mining that separates operations like Parker's from weekend prospectors. One strong cleanup, even a genuinely strong one, does not tell you the size of a deposit. It tells you that gold exists in that specific pocket of ground. It says nothing about how far that pocket extends, how thick the pay layer is across the wider area, or whether the crew has stumbled onto the edge of something much bigger or simply found a one rich spot in an otherwise average stretch of ground. This is exactly where the enormous number of people are now throwing around for 152 million needs to be understood for what it actually is. That figure is not gold sitting in a pile at the wash plant. It is not a number confirmed by any assay report or independent geological survey. It is a theoretical ceiling, the kind of number that gets calculated when you take the most optimistic estimate of how far a channel might extend, multiply it by the thickness of the pay layer, multiply that by an assumed average grade, and then price all of that hypothetical gold at current market rates. Every one of those inputs is an assumption, and every assumption carries the very real possibility of being wrong. In placer mining, the gap between a headline number like that and what actually ends up in the cleanup buckets by the end of the season is often enormous. Parker understands this better than the people getting excited on social media ever will, because he has lived through both sides of it. He has had seasons where an early discovery blew up into a genuinely record-setting run, and he has had seasons where a promising start on paper quietly faded into average ground once the crew pushed past the first rich pocket. That history is exactly why his response to this discovery was not to throw his entire fleet at the new ground overnight. Instead, the plan became methodical. More test holes spreading further out in every direction, more separated test cleanups from different sections of the layer, and constant comparison of gold grade, gravel depth, and bedrock shape across every new data point the crew collected. There's also a harder, more practical side to this story that rarely gets mentioned when a big number like 452 million starts circulating. Even if the channel does extend as far as the most hopeful readings suggest, actually mining it comes with real costs and real risk. Overburden has to be stripped away before the pay layer can even be reached, and depending on how deep this channel sits, that could mean moving a staggering amount of waste material before a single truckload of true pay dirt gets to the plant. Groundwater is another constant threat in Yukon placer ground, and if this old channel sits low enough, water intrusion could slow the whole operation down and require additional pumping just to keep the pit workable. Every extra hour of overburden removal, every extra pump running, every extra mile haul truck has to drive between the cut, and the plant adds cost that eats directly into whatever gold eventually comes out of the ground. Then there is the season itself, which never stops being the biggest constraint of all. The Yukon mining season is short, and once the ground starts to freeze, no amount of promising test holes matters until spring. If Parker commits too much time to cautious testing, he risks losing valuable weeks that could have been spent processing ground he already knows is productive. If he moves too fast and commits heavy equipment to a channel that turns out to be smaller than hoped, he risks burning through fuel, labor, and machine hours on ground that never pays it back. Balancing those two risks against each other, speed against certainty, is the real skill that separates a seasoned operator from someone simply chasing a big number, and it is exactly the kind of decision Parker has had to make more than once in his career on this claim. As of the most recent reports from the crew, the picture is still forming rather than finished. Additional test holes continue to come back with a similar pattern of compacted gravel over smooth bedrock, which keeps the ancient channel theory alive and credible. Test cleanups from different points along the layer have shown gold consistently enough that nobody on the crew believes this was a single lucky pocket, but the full boundary of the deposit, the true average grade across its entire length, and the real cost of mining it out have not yet been fully mapped. In other words, the mystery Parker's bucket uncovered is real. The early signs are genuinely promising, and the eventual scale of it could turn out to be significant. But the 452 million figure remains exactly what it started as, an ambitious ceiling calculated from best-case assumptions, not a number sitting confirmed in the bank. What makes this moment compelling to watch is not whether that specific dollar figure ends up being accurate. It almost certainly will not land on that exact number either way. What makes it compelling is watching how a genuinely experienced miner handles the moment between discovery and proof, the stretch of time where excitement has to be held in check by discipline, where a promising pan has to be followed by dozens of unglamorous test holes before anyone commits real resources to it. That is the part of gold mining that rarely gets the spotlight, but is the part that actually determines whether a season becomes legendary or forgettable. Whatever this buried layer turns out to be in the end, whether it becomes the richest ground Parker has ever worked or settles into just another solid, unremarkable pocket in a long career full of them, the next few weeks of testing will tell the real story. The bucket that hit something unexpected beneath the Klondike may have only found a modest surprise, or may have found the edge of something that keeps this crew digging long after the rest of the season is wrapped up elsewhere. Either way, the only honest answer right now is that nobody knows for certain yet, not even Parker himself, And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the next cleanup worth watching.